All right, hello everybody and welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the progressive presidents. These were the presidents during the progressive era that are actually going to be using the government to help the people instead of being all laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is the hands-off approach. It means that government typically and traditionally in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, had not been involved in directly putting regulations onto business. It'd been standing back, letting those big businessmen, those robber barons, take over. The first of the presidents that will be considered progressive, that is going to do stuff to help the little guy, the average, common, poor American citizen, is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt has a very popular nickname. He's known as Teddy Roosevelt. There's a story about when Teddy, or Theodore Roosevelt, was hunting. He loved to hunt down in the South, and he was hunting black bears. Some of his friends tied up these black bear cubs to a tree and had Teddy came over and, they were like, hey, we could do a cool photo op of you shooting these ferocious black bear cubs, little baby bears. And Teddy was like, I'm not going to shoot these bears like that. They're tied up to a tree. That's not very sportsmanlike. And so this story got out that he spared these little bear cubs, and he's Teddy Roosevelt. And there will be obviously the actual stuffed animal, the teddy bear, that will be named after him. But Theodore Roosevelt was born as a very sickly young man. He suffered from asthma, so he had breathing difficulties. Now, back in the late 1800s, when Teddy was born, there wasn't those inhalers, for to clear up the passageways. And so asthma was a much more serious complication that led to death for many children who had it. Teddy's parents were very wealthy, of the Oyster Bay Roosevelt family, and so they could afford the best doctors that money could buy, but all doctors could recommend was just, fresh air and sunshine for this little boy. And they said, hopefully he survives. And that's what the parents do. They take him outdoors, and it's kind of nature that Teddy sees is what saved him. And so he's going to have a great love for nature for the rest of his life. He's a big outdoorsman, a big hunter. And remember that in the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he had commissioned the Great White Fleet, a new modernized fleet of warships for the United States that will be used by Commodore Dewey to defeat the Spanish very successfully at Manila Bay in the Philippines. And Teddy had quit his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and had basically decided to form up his own ragtag group to fight in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, known as the Rough Riders. So Teddy and his Rough Riders will receive acclaim and accolades, mostly for their famed battle on San Juan Hill, when it was actually, remember, the Buffalo Soldiers that reached it first. But Teddy Roosevelt becomes a big hero of the Spanish-American War in 1898. But that was a splendid little war, just 4 months long, against Spain, where we get the Philippines, where we get Guam, where we get Puerto Rico, and we kind of get Cuba. And so from that war, Teddy Roosevelt, as the leader of this famous Rough Riders, this war hero, he will be named as President McKinley's vice president when President McKinley runs for re-election in 1900, again running against the populist, dun, 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 the populist candidate, William Jennings Bryan, who ran again in 1900, just as he had in 1896 as a Democrat. McKinley will again, because he's got those big business interests, he's got all that money, his campaign financing coming from those robber barons, McKinley will again beat Bryan, but this time he has a new vice president, this war hero, Teddy Roosevelt. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because McKinley does have a lot of money from these businessmen backing him up. In many ways, the robber barons like Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, they felt like they owned McKinley. And remember that the poor men, the working class people, the farmers, the poor factory workers, the populists, they felt gypped. They felt like this election had been rigged because of the moneyed interests. And so one of these anarchists, a guy named Leon Scholzgos, who is very upset with the way this election turned out and with the robber barons basically controlling McKinley's administration, he is going to assassinate President William McKinley in September of 1901. shortly after McKinley had, been sworn in that March in his reelection. And so President McKinley, he is shot in the gut. This is one of those, classic Leon Schultz goes in as a waiter in this fancy banquet. It was at the World Expose in Buffalo, New York. And he's got one of those trays with like the domed, fancy waiter top things. And appetizers, Mr. President. And then boom, there's a gun and he shoots McKinley in the gut. The president lingers on for nearly a week in agonizing, painful, bullet going through his guts, pain, and before he finally dies. And now the Vice President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, is our president. Now here's the deal. McKinley was a Republican. He was backed by these big business interests that felt like they owned McKinley because they got him elected with all their money. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't owned by nobody. Teddy Roosevelt was technically a Republican. His family were Republicans. But Teddy's not your typical Republican. He's not in the pocket of big business. Teddy's going to do what he wants. And he's also a very incredibly young president. He's the youngest that we've ever had, actually, at just 42 years old. Even John F. Kennedy will be slightly older when he becomes president, because John F. Kennedy was also the youngest elected president. Teddy Roosevelt became president first because McKinley was assassinated and Teddy had been the VP. So anyway, that's who we're talking about, Teddy Roosevelt, the guy who kicked asthma's butt when he was 5 years old, the guy who, survived against all the odds, the Rough Rider, the man of action. He's now president of the United States. Hold on to your saddles. Let's see what he's going to do. He says he's here to help the people, and he has a plan to make everything work and to make things better for Americans, a fair deal for everyone, he said. He's going to call it his square deal, okay? And Teddy Roosevelt is going to be also one of the first modern presidents, meaning he uses the power of the presidency, of the White House, as his bully pulpit. And what we mean by bully pulpit, we mean like his stage, his sounding board from which to talk directly to the American people using his position to basically influence what happens, the bully pulpit, the power of the presidency. So he's going to be a new kind of leader. His square deal, okay, is going to involve the 3 C's. The square deal is going to be about, here we go. It's going to be about protecting consumers. So this is in 1906 when you have the publication of The Jungle. Teddy Roosevelt had just been elected for the first time after filling out, the rest of McKinley's presidency. Teddy Roosevelt is overwhelmingly popularly elected in his own right in 1904. And in 1906, this book called The Jungle by the muckraker Upton Sinclair was published. And in this book, remember, we talked about how Sinclair had gone undercover in a meatpacking plant. He wrote about all the disgusting, nasty stuff that went into people's meat, including, the fingertips of these workers, how people were eating, these human body parts, how people were eating, rat poison and rat meat and rat poop, and the poison that was supposed to be going into, the rats at the slaughterhouses and stuff, these meatpacking plants where the meat was processed. And how a lot of the meat that was being sold at the butcher shops and at the grocers and stuff was actually rancid, months old rotten meat that was coated and covered in Glorax and glycerin and other stuff to make it look shiny and new. Right? Like a lot of nasty stuff. That's what this book, The Jungle, was about. And when the public read this, they were horrified. Yeah, maybe some people felt bad for how the workers were treated and how the workers, had to live. But most people felt disgusted at what was going into the meat that they were consuming, that they were buying. And so Teddy Roosevelt is going to be enacting many protections and pushing for Congress to enact many protections for consumers, such as the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Meat Inspection Act is going to enforce from the federal government that meat inspectors are going into the slaughterhouses and the meat processing plants like Upton Sinclair had gone into, and that they're making sure that none of that nasty stuff is going on. That's what meat inspectors do. The Pure Food and Drug Act, this is where you're going to have food nutrition guidelines from the national government to where food industries and drink industries and medication industries, drug industries, all of these businesses will have to comply with federal regulations. They won't be allowed to put toxins and poisons into people's food and drink and medications anymore. Like cocaine used to be a very popular like medicine that they would put into all kinds of remedies, even for like babies. Oh, your baby's colicking, here's some cocaine. Or medication called something else that had cocaine as a main ingredient. And yeah, you feel really great at first, and then your baby wouldn't be doing so well. But they used to put all kinds of very toxic, very deadly substances into people's things that they consumed. The Food and Drug Administration is going to stop that from occurring. It's also going to be requiring these industries to report what ingredients go into their products. Okay, so this is where like today, anything that you eat, I'm looking around for my lunch, anything that you drink, you know, they have those nutrition labels on them showing exactly what has gone into the stuff you're putting into your body. So that's the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's going to eventually create the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, which is a very important part of our government today, keeping consumers safe. So that's a big part of Teddy's square deal, the things he's working for to make America better. It's about protecting consumers, consumer protections. And that's the first C. If you want to think about like this square deal, it has 3 C's as part of it. That's the first one. The second C is going to be about taking on corrupt corporations. You like my alliteration there? Okay. So corporations that had become corrupt, we're thinking like those monopolies. All right. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be a trust buster. Okay. Trust busting, remember, trust is like another word for a monopoly at this time. Okay. It's when businesses have consolidated and formed a giant business that like rules an entire industry, and they have like a board basically deciding on common prices and stuff, price fixing. So that's a trust. A monopoly is like a trust. If you are busting up a trust, you are breaking up that monopoly into smaller businesses so it can no longer monopolize the industry, raise up prices, and curb competition. Okay. So Teddy Roosevelt is going to dust off the old Sherman Antitrust Act from 1890. Sherman, that law had never really been used up to this point the way it was intended. Teddy Roosevelt identifies good and bad trusts. Good trusts were like what he said Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel was. That Carnegie Steel was providing a valuable product that was helping build America. He called Andrew Carnegie like a captain of industry, a guy whose, you know, steel rails were helping build the nation's infrastructure. So he said that was a good trust. He said, I'm not going to mess with those. Instead, Teddy identified bad trusts as like the Northern Securities firm, JP Morgan's big holding firm for like 3 separate railroad companies that controlled, monopolized all of the railroads, all of the trains that were west of the Mississippi. And so for like the Northern Securities firm that Teddy identified as a bad trust, Teddy's going to bust it up, okay, using the Sherman Act. Teddy's also going to use the old Interstate Commerce Act, okay, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission, to also go after monopolies that he identified as being corrupt. And again, a monopoly that was bad was one that was limiting competition, hurting consumers, being bad for the United States, okay? So like with the Interstate Commerce Commission, Teddy Roosevelt is gonna push Congress to pass this law called the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act in 1906 is going to give the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Act, and the commission a little bit more authority to go after these railroad companies, especially the ones that were abusing farmers. So again, it's about setting standardized rates for shipping. It's about getting after them for trust busting if they're forming these big monopolies. It's about breaking them up, okay? So the Hepburn Act is going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission created by the ICA. Teddy's going to be using the Sherman and the ICC to basically go after these bad monopolies. He's a trust buster. So that's the second C, taking on corrupt corporations. And then the final C, this was about conservation. Conservation means you are protecting the environment. You're trying to save land and resources for future generations, okay? Now, conservation is not the exact same thing as preservation. Preservation is when you're trying to keep something exactly the way it is. The environmental movement was like a new thing at this time. John Muir, pictured right here with Teddy Roosevelt at the beautiful national park in California called Yosemite. There's the Yosemite waterfalls, when it's early at dawn and the sun is just starting to peek over those mountains and shine onto that waterfall, you get like a prism rainbow effect. Double rainbow, yeah, there you go. But that's like at Yosemite in California. So there's John Muir, who was big and into environmentalism in the late 1800s, who helped to create one of the first environmental protection groups in the United States called the Sierra Club. And they were all about, not only, enjoying nature, but also protecting it for future generations to enjoy. Because at this time, remember, from like the Gilded Age, you had all these cities being built, these skyscrapers, reaching into the heavens, all these railroads being built all over the place. Everything was being built up, and many people started to have the concern that there wouldn't be anything left. Nature previously for a lot of the 1800s had meant conquering the West, conquering the land, building houses on it, taming the wild nature, including taming the Native Americans, right? Well, now that most of it has been tamed, the West has been won. Remember Frederick Jackson Turner's closing of the frontier thesis from 1890. The West has been won. The land has mostly been tamed. Now people are starting to think, oh gosh, maybe we tamed too much of it. What if there's nothing left? Okay, we need to enjoy nature. Nature is now becoming a place to have fun and recreation, to be able to smell like clean air that hasn't been polluted, and be able to, be out there in nature. And so that's what this conservation movement was about. And the first national park had already actually been created in 1872. Our oldest national park is in Wyoming at Yellowstone. You have Old Faithful, the geyser, and Yogi Bear and all that. That's Yellowstone. John Muir and the Sierra Club. You also have the Antiquities Act passed that basically allows the president, this is from the 1890s, to set aside land that is designated as historical and important to not be, messed with. And that's what's going to allow President Roosevelt to basically start setting aside new national parks. And so it's really Teddy Roosevelt that we have to thank for saving this land that will become our national parks. It's not technically going to be made into the national parks yet. The national park system will be created a little bit later under Woodrow Wilson. But Teddy sets aside millions and millions of acres of American land, including, the Grand Canyon for future generations to enjoy. He had a great love for the outdoors and for nature. And there he is jumping on his horse and stuff. He loved to box, he loved to fish, he loved to hunt, he loved to hunt. It's Teddy Roosevelt. When it came to foreign policy, Teddy Roosevelt is going to do a lot. He's a very active, again, very progressive president. And by the way, before we move on too much, remember, Teddy's got his square deal for domestic policy. It's got the 3 C's. He's protecting consumers, he's taking on corrupt corporations with that trust busting, and he is conserving nature. And setting aside land that will become our national parks. Okay, so this is big things, this 3 C's with this square deal. For foreign policy, as a hunter, Teddy Roosevelt often liked to quote this Eastern African, or what he thought was an Eastern African proverb that said, speak softly and carry a big stick. And so Teddy's foreign policy is sometimes summed up as the big stick policy. But basically what this meant is that Teddy Roosevelt is going to use our military and this Great White Fleet. You can see them right there. They're not sharks. They're modern ships with steel siding. He's going to use the Great White Fleet of our Navy to basically exert American influence abroad, and mostly in the region of Latin America. Teddy Roosevelt will successfully negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth, a peace agreement between Japan and Russia from their war between each other in 1905. That's going to be negotiated in Maine, kind of upping the prestige of the United States. Look, we are a civilized, powerful nation able to negotiate treaties between other powerful nations. Look at us. The Panama Canal is originally in the nation of Panama. It's owned by Colombia, this country right here. We really wanted to build a canal right there to, link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and help benefit our military and our trade and our economy. To get this land right there, though, this Panama Strip, or at this little isthmus, we needed to get it free from Colombia. So Teddy Roosevelt is actually going to help the Panamanians break away from Colombia by offering them some military assistance. in return for the Panama Canal Zone. The French had tried building a canal there earlier in the 1800s, but had had limited success. We basically are going to create an artificial lake in the middle of this isthmus right here. We're going to flood it with dams, and then we're going to build a series of locks. Interlocking locks like these are going to allow a ship to sail in. The doors come down, you sail in, and then the lock fills up with water and it elevates the ship like a giant elevator. And then the ship will go into the next step, and then the water will lift up as the gates close, and then it'll go to the next step, go across this artificial lake, and then go down the series of locks. The water will drain, so the elevator going down, and then it can go out into the other ocean. And this is how the Panama Canal works. It's the world's greatest shortcut. It took us 10 years to build. It took hundreds of thousands of lives to build. Many of the workers were from Latin America. Many of them were Panamanians or other Central American workers. Many of them will die from diseases. From the Spanish American War, we do have quinine. We have a way to fight tropical diseases like yellow fever and stuff, but still most workers will die from disease. And 10 years, 100,000, thousands of workers, and millions of dollars later, and we will have the Panama Canal, which reduces the time, it took to move things from the Atlantic to the Pacific from months down to just 20 days. We can now move our fleets of ships very quickly from over in New York over to the Pacific, to places like Hawaii, to places like the Philippines, to places like China. And this will be very, very important for America going into the 20th century. So that's the Panama Canal, and Teddy Roosevelt was instrumental in getting that built. We start building it in 1904. It will be opened in 1914, and you could see some of the gates on the locks there under construction. So that's the Panama Canal. Teddy Roosevelt using his Great White Fleet. Again, that's big stick policy. We're going to use our military to exert our influence to protect American business interests in Latin America, that's Central America, the Caribbean, South America. Roosevelt's basically adding on to the old Monroe Doctrine here. He calls it the Roosevelt Corollary. But what this means is that, Monroe had said in his doctrine that the West was closed for colonization, and that America would not interfere in European affairs. Europeans would not interfere in any new American affairs. We're going to be isolated. That's the Monroe Doctrine, which had propelled American foreign policy from 1820s until, Teddy Roosevelt. Well, here in the early 1900s under Teddy's going to add on to the Monroe Doctrine by saying America will be the cowboy, the policeman, policing the Western Hemisphere. This is our neck of the woods. We're the sheriff in town. If there are disputes, we will settle them with our military might. Big stick, okay? And we will intervene in affairs in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and in Cuba and the Caribbean. We're going to be interfering all over the place using our ships and our Navy and our Marines. The next president was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt's named William Howard Taft. He runs also as a Republican, but just like Teddy, he is a progressive. And old Taft, he is a very, very large president. So I'm going to do one more lecture, also really short, where I'm going to talk about Taft and about the crazy election of 1912. So thank you guys for listening, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.